just now went on here.
Is it preview broadcast?
Happy days are here again, the skies above are clear again. Let us sing a song of cheer again. Happy days are here again. All together, shout it now. There's no one who can doubt it now. So let's tell the world all about it now. Happy days are here again. Your cares and troubles are gone. There'll be no more from now on. Happy days are here again. The skies above are clear again. Let us sing a song of cheer again. Happy days are here again. So long sad times, so long bad times, we are rid of you at last. Howdy gay times, cloudy gray times, you are now a thing of the past.
Happy days are here again, the skies above are clear again. Let us sing a song of cheer again. Happy days are here again. All together, shout it now. There's no one who can doubt it now. So let's tell the world about it now. Happy days are here again. Your cares and troubles are gone.
It's an art.
There'll be no more from now on. Happy days are here again. The skies above are clear again. Let us sing a song of cheer again. Happy days are here again.
Let's go. A minute. You want to play it all?
How long have we gone?
Two and a half.
Oh, we can stop.
Okay, what's up, guys?
Hey, guys.
We're 2 minutes late, or 2 weeks late for Ides
Yeah.
of January, but it's my schedule.
But we were back for another edition of the Ides of January. It was on the 13th, but better late than never. And we're still here making the Ides again. Making the Ides great again, even though things haven't quite worked out as the way we thought they would.
But that's okay. We're going to get into that tonight. We're going to talk about nostalgia and where that word comes from, and there's actually good and bad sides to nostalgia.
Right.
And so I guess we're going to dive in because nostalgia is a good thing. It's a good tool.
Yeah, and so we're going to talk about nostalgia, and then we're going to talk about the 1876 election of Rutherford B. Hayes.
Yeah, I guess we're going to juxtapose or kind of compare the elections in 1877 and in 2020.
Because they're shockingly alike.
Because if you've seen us in the past, this is our 35th episode, but over and over again, we get from the Bible that there's nothing new under the sun.
Right. And that this is a spiritual battle, and it always has been. And then we're going to end it with, in one of our, actually last January's scope, I mentioned something called the Red House Report. It was from the CIA, and it's got some interesting, and actually next month's
scope, we're gonna
really delve into that report. But I think we've got a lot of good stuff to enlighten you with tonight. And this is not about nostalgia, looking backwards. We're about looking forwards. So nostalgia is an interesting term.
And nostalgia is can be a good tool for everyone if we use it right. And going into this subject, looking into it and researching, and there's a lot more we could do. And I'm kind of constrained because of my new work schedule, but we're going to do the best we can here for you to show that there's a bad kind of nostalgia, and it's been kind of drilled into us with the media going back to the 50s, the World War II, and the 50s and the 60s, 70s, and for all of this, and for me too, we remembered things that actually didn't happen the way we thought they did.
Right.
It goes into what is real about history and politics in the past, and our media, our music, and everything. So we'll kind of dive into this. And there were some very interesting things about nostalgia. But first of all, we've got nostalgia was a word first coined by a man named Johann Hofer. He was a Swiss medical student in the 17th century, 1600s. He coined this term from the Greek nostos, which means homecoming, and algos, which means pain or ache.
Yes, that is Trumpy Bear behind us.
And he coined this term because he was studying Swiss mercenaries, especially away from their homeland, fighting in France, in the plains of France. And these soldiers were coming down with this melancholy that they couldn't explain. And these guys were homesick, and they were, longing for their homes and their country. And they were diagnosing these guys with this nostalgia, and some of them were dying. And really the only cure was, putting them out of the army and sending them home was the only cure that they had.
Delph Sage says, I watched your feed on Biden's stolen inauguration day in Washington. I really appreciate it. You're welcome. I'm glad that I live streamed it so that I have proof that I wasn't inside the Capitol, because they seem to be going after everybody down there.
So, like I said, it was a form of melancholy, and nostalgia was something. It was being diagnosed with soldiers going up into the 1850s and 60s. Right. It was kind of starting to wane, kind of get out of fashion, I guess, in the medical community in the 1850s. But the Northern armies in the Civil War here had problems with nostalgia, and they had, I think it was 2,500, 2,200 men diagnosed with it.
It was 13 that was the cause of death. Died. But I found it interesting that it was from the North. It was the troops from the North. Yeah,
we couldn't find anything that the Confederate armies were getting diagnosed with this, and this is just conjecture on my part, but could it be that they didn't have this same malady because they were defending their turf, and the Northern armies were actually coming in and
leaving their homes.
Leaving their homes. The men in the Confederate armies were defending their homes and their states and stuff. So that's we couldn't find anything about it on the Confederate side, but the term nostalgia was still being maybe not diagnosed, but kind of describing soldiers in World War I and II. Yeah. And from what we found, it was predominantly American armies too. And I would conjecture again that that's because we were away from home. Our soldiers they were in a foreign land, and they were shooting and killing other people.
Yeah, we grew up in this great country, the freest country on earth, and you send them across the seas to go and kill people. I can imagine that did create some kind of syndrome.
And so, nostalgia can be a good thing and it can be a bad thing. And, what it does is there's important events and people one care about, places where you've spent time. A good nostalgia is like you remember,
your grandmother's homemade baked bread
or something. Yeah. Oh yeah. The biscuits that we used to have for dinner.
Oh, they're so good.
That she made from scratch every night.
Yeah.
Things like that. And then there's a bad form of nostalgia, and we're going to get into that more and the media plays into this, and the way our history.
I think our media feeds into that negative nostalgia
and it's negative for us because we start remembering a time that we don't actually remember ourselves. It's like in the zeitgeist that
it wasn't real. We're remembering something that wasn't real.
And we're remembering a past media that was good, that Walter Cronkite. He got up there and he was level and he just told you how it was. And you know what? We talk about lately here that this is a spiritual battle we're in, and it's not a red-blue thing. And we've got to start kind of stepping back and looking at what's so-called the other side, which is really isn't. These are we're starting to see with recent events with GameStop and stuff that the actual there is a divide line, and at the most basic it's evil and good, but it's not red and blue or left and right. It's us. We've been getting played. Our parents were played. Our grandparents were played. Their parents were played, and it's been building. I think especially since World War II, and then getting into the 50s with the media expansion, and now you've got social media where there's so much connectedness, and there's positives to that as well. But this nostalgia on the negative side is having feelings for a time that really never was. And this spiritual battle, we should have been in this spiritual battle the whole time. We were looking at victories and losses in the physical realm here on earth, and when we're not thinking about the spiritual
victories
side
that weren't actually victories.
No, they weren't. And so we're going to, I was looking at things that trigger nostalgia, and you guys know this, but an old song or old photos, a food you eat or the weather or some smell you get or a color, some kind of situation. And some of that you can get into the good side of nostalgia, which this good side of nostalgia can be good for your psyche and your well-being. It can give you a sense of connectedness. Yeah. It can give you comfort and even existential meaning, because you can remember times. And for me and Yvonne, we remember good things about our grandmother, and these are memories that happened to us.
Right, they're real.
This is the good side of nostalgia, and you can relearn lessons, you can remember lessons that you got, and I can look back on things like with Granddad too, and just some one-word phrases. Or one day when I'm washing my car across the street, and he called me over and he said, "That tells me something about you." And it tells it to other people too. He made me realize people are watching.
Right.
And you're setting an example every day. And so that gives me a connectedness to a past that was a good time for me.
Right.
And that's a positive aspect. And it gives you a growth oriented personality, gives you a positive look, and it gives you a positive look for the future. And so then there's some negative sides to nostalgia. And during the research, I found a term that I didn't realize, but I couldn't put it into words, but called vicarious nostalgia. And that's what media has been doing since the 50s, the 60s, and on up until now. And social media is doing this now. Right. And the media gets allies with the social media now, because then people pile on and we all choose sides, and there's black and white and red and blue, and we start fighting each other. And that's not that there are probably a lot more commonalities between us, but we don't see it because you have this mental block. Image. And on the negative side of nostalgia, it gives you a defense mechanism to kind of avoid what the real past is. And we're all guilty of it. And I used to look at the past and see some of the things I was talking about, like positive media and stuff. Right. Journalists overall were never really a good thing. They weren't honest in the past. I mean, there was never a time when the media actually reported the news. Not in the last 100. Even during the days of the Revolution. That's why Ben Franklin and the pamphleteers, they were going against the mainstream who had control of the press. They were the little social media outcasts. There was never a time when the media reported the truth. And there wasn't a golden time, go back to the 50s. There wasn't a golden time where government was just here to benefit. To do the common welfare and to help public servants that wanted to serve you. Yeah, to provide for the common good and help us to in our pursuits of happiness. That was never a thing. And this spiritual battle is something we should have been fighting the whole time. And what's so great about these times today, I think, is that there is a veil being shattered. And
it's being lifted.
We've been talking about the meaning of apocalypse and things like that.
And the meaning of apocalypse is it's not the end of the world. It's in ancient Greek is a great revealing
and unveiling.
And my goodness, there's been a great revealing in the last year, and it's continuing.
And people think it's apocalyptic times, and it is, but it's not. It's not mushroom clouds and people dying. But it's
about
and zombies.
revelation.
It's about seeing and veils coming off of your eyes. And more on the negative aspects of this is the media has played into this negative nostalgia that we have for times past, and they, Coca-Cola and other big companies, they use nostalgia to sell their products, and it gets us into it's the constant propagation by the media that makes us remember a time that we actually don't remember.
That never was. They remember they conjure up these memories that they're not real. It's one giant psyop.
And it gives you a false sense of connectedness that doesn't help you moving forward.
Right.
And I used to feel connected with other Republicans, and I still would if we have same values and things. But because if you don't know where you came from, you can't. It's just like those who don't remember history are doomed to repeat history. And so, it's kind of like that. We're all living in this matrix. They've created this world, the Truman Show, whatever you want to call it. They've created this vision. They've coded this into our brain that this is how things are. And it's constant over and over again over decades of this past that never was.
Yeah. And you can see it. You saw it happen with COVID. So, when it was just getting going and they started doing the lockdowns, if you notice the commercials began immediately, like doing the mask and the social distancing, and it started showing you these awesome videos of being at home, and they
use the music too, the soft music.
Yeah, they use the music. Yeah, it's really pretty music.
And the alone together over and over again, and in this together, and now more than ever. How many times has that phrase been used in advertisements?
We're all in this together, and we're actually not.
And then the politicians have always used this tool as well. They've used this false nostalgia to persuade voters to do this and that, and to support certain things.
Nostalgia is it's a persuader. It's influence.
Nostalgia is a powerful tool, and it's something. It's obviously something innate in us as humans that something triggers something in our mind, that we remember.
Right.
It's usually for good. It's supposed to be something that strengthens your ties to that good past.
Right.
But you got to remember the good side at the most basic, I think, nostalgia. Good side of nostalgia is things that you actually remember, good life lessons, things like that. And then the bad side is you think of a time, the way America was in 1984.
Right.
1980. I don't know.
Yeah, that's funny.
But just say 85.
Yeah.
Reagan's already been reelected. He had a big landslide, and so you think of, oh man, we had it going the right direction then, and we didn't, because Reagan did several terrible things.
He turned California forever blue. He came up with the divorce without fault.
The no-fault divorce in California.
Divorce.
We've and that goes to us putting our faith in men on this earth. Men and women, whichever. It's.
I still like Trump, but I'm still of the mindset that he's just a man, and to place these high. To place him above, it's like people put him as a god. He's not a god. None of us are. Only God is God, and they can err. They can make errors, and even though I know a lot of people that watch us, we don't like how the election turned out, but there's literally nothing new under the sun. It's happened before,
and so that brings us to we've got Rutherford B. Hayes, and we've got Joe Biden, and how each one of them won their elections. And this is going to, it's the storyline is, if there was red and blue back then, Rutherford was the red.
Yeah, he was.
But he did they did a lot of the same things to kind of upturn the Electoral College, and that happened this time around. And so you got to start thinking, what this has happened before. It's like they had the game plan in 1877.
1876
for 2020.
Rutherford B. Hayes won. Well, actually, the guy that he was running against, Tillman. Yeah, I think it's Tillman. Tillman. He was the governor of New York. He was a Democrat. So the election happens, and Tillman he's at 184. He's one electoral vote short of winning the presidency. And Rutherford B. Hayes needed 19 electoral votes. And strangely enough, there were 4 states that were contested.
And Rutherford B. Hayes was close to conceding. He was almost ready to concede.
Right. And something happened. And so what they did was they formed an electoral Grant did this. Ulysses S. Grant formed an electoral commission composed of, 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, and 5 from the Supreme Court.
It was supposed to be 1 independent.
Yeah, supposed to be 1 independent. You were supposed to have like half Democrat, half Republican, and then 1 independent. And the guy that they had as an independent, David Davis, they gave him a Senate
the Republicans engineered for him to
win a
take
Senate
over a vacant Senate seat. I can't remember what state.
And so he ended up backing out, which then that left them with appointing another Republican.
An associate justice who was considered a Republican.
Right. And so if you start reading about this, you see that they met in secret.
Well, even before the commission, didn't they? They sent lawyers and other guys down to
Florida, the swing state,
Florida, South Carolina,
Louisiana, and Oregon.
And of course, Florida was in the mix.
And Oregon was too. 1 vote, 1 electoral. So that 1 state would have given.
It had 3, but 1 was still kind of out.
Yeah. It would have given him the win if he had gotten that 1. They did it when they decided it. It was done at 4:10 a.m. in the morning.
And it was the Republican side with Rutherford B. Hayes in a conspiracy with the Democrat minority, most of them from the South.
Right.
They made a deal. And the Democrats didn't, because the Democrats could have stopped this.
So they made a deal. So this was after the Civil War, and Reconstruction was going on. And so Reconstruction involved federal enforcement
it was the Union,
in the South.
Yeah, the Union Army occupied all the states. They weren't all admitted to the Union yet, readmitted to the Union yet. So they were basically under martial law.
Right. They were. And so they made a deal. They told Rutherford B. Hayes that, we'll give it to you, but you need to end Reconstruction, pull the troops out. And also they wanted him to reform civil, what was it called? Civil. However, when a president gets elected and he starts appointing people.
The civil service.
Yeah, civil service. And apparently there was a lot of corruption. Like a lot of those appointments went to people that contributed to your campaign, or, it was a pay-for-play thing. So he had to make the deal that he would reform that.
It's really good that doesn't happen now.
Yeah. Well, the truth of the matter is, when he did do this, I mean, come on, they didn't really reform that. We all know it's a pay-to-play. It always has been. So they agreed to that. But the interesting thing is the Democrats for that 4 years never considered Hayes the actual winner. And they had nicknames for him. And one of them was his fraudulency. I don't know who on Twitter, I don't know if it was Nick Nolte or it's somebody on the right that said, I will refer to Biden the next 4 years as his fraudulency. Well, Rutherford B. Hayes was his fraudulency before Joe Biden. And another name that they had for him was, so his name was Rutherford. They called him Rutherfraud. So it's like we've got the embodiment of
and you
Hayes.
can see that they were just as clever then as they are now. And I'm being facetious because they're not really that clever now.
They're not. So you had half the electorate not believing that you won, which you didn't actually win. Y'all just made deals, in the dark rooms at 4 a.m. at night.
But then what are we seeing now is that, nothing new under the sun comes into play again. And, this is the system that's been in place for quite a long time.
So this has happened before. So a lot of people think, oh my God, this is going to be the end. It's, and I'm still of the belief that I still can't fully wrap my brain around the fact that this guy Biden, who, they counted the ballots in secret. They wouldn't let the poll observers. It's just so un-American that I can't believe it. But it's happened before, and so that's actually kind of comforting and nostalgic.
Yeah,
in a way. And there's
we're gonna have to break down your form of nostalgia off camera and see how you're doing. So
yeah. And interesting things when you start reading about Rutherford B. Hayes. He only served one term. That was another thing, is that he promised to only serve one term, and he did. Who knows whether that was? I happen to think
of the deal.
I happen to think that he wouldn't have gotten,
because he had no intention of running. I guess didn't Johnson do that after Kennedy?
Yeah,
didn't he do that?
Yeah, but see, Johnson was in the same boat. Everybody was tired of the Vietnam War. He wouldn't have been reelected. So a lot of these people don't run again just to save face. I happen to think that's what the deal was with Rutherford B. Hayes. But if you go back and you start reading about his term, he had the strike, the 1877 railroad strike.
Yeah.
And so you have to think of the railroad, everybody worked for the railroad. If you think of people like Amazon, FedEx, everybody in the world works for them. Well, imagine that they've got slave-like conditions and it's horrible, and they reduce your pay because we had a economic
collapse in
downturn.
73, 5 years or
and
5 years before, 4 years before.
That was manual labor and how bad that they had it. And if you were treating them that bad, and you had those guys that were actually working for the railroad, you had their families and their friends, and there was an uprising and there was a strike that started in one city. I can't remember the city. But then it spread. So they're like, okay, you're going to treat us like this. We're going to get out in the streets. And it kind of reminded me of today, when after the November 3rd election and everybody went to their capitals, and, January 6th, when there was over 1 million people in DC. Well, they had these same kind of protests over the railroad strikes. And so he had the army come and quell the protests. And it's funny because one of the descriptions of it was, they were expecting, a riot. When they got there, all it was just peaceful protesting. Mm-hmm. Same thing as what's going on now, but that they call out the feds.
Well, then they got into some further in, and there were some violent riots.
Yeah.
And the army comes in and people die on both sides.
Right.
But then
and that's how
Posse Comitatus Act comes out
because of this, and they're like, no, you don't need to be able to do this ever again.
We can't have the army policing on the domestic side.
But that was a populist uprising. The American people were being treated wrong. The election was stolen, and they're like, people had enough.
Yeah.
And the federal government and the powers that be, they react the way that they always do. They overplay their hand.
And that it's kind of like I don't know if it's a wave or a pendulum that keeps swinging back and forth, and it went too far back then. And I get the sense that that's where we're at now, where it's kind of gone too far again. And I'm not talking about a Democrat or a Republican getting power. I'm talking about what people are perceiving as what's really happening. And I think it's kind of opening up right now.
Right.
And people are going, wait a minute.
They're like, whoa, because the game stopped.
And it's that spiritual warfare too, is that we should have been engaged on the spiritual side from decades ago. And we're seeing the fruits of.
Well, we're seeing the lack of fruits from the failure of the pulpit, which really didn't prepare us for this, because they've become very worldly, and we have to remember that this battle is not flesh and blood. And we've been deluded into thinking that it was. And
it's a thing, even you take it with man, a man can be corrupted, and whether it's be for power, for money, or for whatever it is, whatever their appetites are, their worldly appetites. And that goes for any section. So, our churches are corrupt, our media is corrupt, our government's corrupt, and that's what it is.
Right.
And it always has been. And it doesn't make it better if our guy is in power or is elected.
If there's a uniparty, which is what we have, really doesn't matter.
You add scientists and the medical profession. Why is the medical profession right now vaunted and put on a pedestal right now?
Right.
They are no better than anybody else. I drive around the country all the time and I see heroes work here all over the place. And I go, heroes are people,
everyday Americans
going to jobs they hate, but they're going to take care of their family until they figure out what they're really going to do. So,
we're all heroes.
We put people on pedestals and none of us belong on pedestals.
Right. And that leads us to the next section of the scope, which is about it's a report called the Red House Report. And you know how the enemy, I was going to say the left. It's not just the left. It's whoever they is, they will accuse you of whatever they're guilty of. Mm-hmm. And just like you saw with Reconstruction and Rutherford B. Hayes and the Democrats in the South, like our ideas of what happened back then are actually opposite, and they've just rewritten history.
In the North, they said, you guys in the South are so racist. I said, it wasn't so much better in the North, sometimes worse. And
it was worse.
I wonder, you wonder why a lot of the black migration came from northern cities into the South.
Well, when they made the agreement, they let Rutherford B. Hayes be president. The other agreement was that also solidified the Democrats in Congress in power. And what they did was the KKK was created. They removed, like, if you were working in government, a lot of people don't know, and I didn't know this, the term half-breeds comes from the Civil War. I guess they were mixed, white and black or whatever, and some people didn't think they should be able to, serve in Congress or whatever. It was when the Democrats got power, they kicked them out of the military, they kicked them out of positions in the government. Mm-hmm. It's just it's backwards. And so they call us Nazis. They call people, and they're not just calling people on the right Nazis and white supremacists. They're calling the Redditors who beat the billionaire hedge funders at their own game. I saw a CNN story where they're trying to relate it to the Stop the Steal, and they called the Stop the Steal people Nazis. Mm-hmm. They're not Nazis. They're just populists that are trying to take our government back. And so if they are guilty of that, which they're calling us, and they're Nazis, I'm here to tell you that the Red House report from the CIA from 1944 will tell you we are literally being governed by Nazis.
And what's intriguing is over and over again when you look back in the past, and this is just from what's been released, is that you can't always trust it. You can't trust the CIA, but the CIA has told us in releases in years past what they've done. Right. And it's not good. What they've released is not good. We don't know what they're still hiding. Real briefly, the revolution in Iran in 1953. I mean, that was the CIA in Britain. Yeah. Just to keep the oil and oil interest for Britain, and it was Republican administration and the re-election of Winston Churchill.
And look at the names involved
that allowed that to go forward.
The Iranian Revolution, Norman Norman's dad.
His dad, and then. I mean, that's a rabbit hole because his dad was also the first man on the scene in Jersey at the Lindbergh kidnapping. Right. It's just, you read all these glowing stories about Storm and Norman from the Gulf War, but hey, it's more interesting what his dad did. Right.
So the Red House report, which I'm just going to touch on it briefly tonight because we're going to delve into this on our next scope, because the Red House report is mind-blowing. But the paper, so it's a U.S. military intelligence report, and it was written in November 1944. It's a detailed account of a secret meeting at the Maison Rouge Hotel in Strasbourg on August 10th, 1944. Nazi officials ordered an elite group of German industrialists to plan for Germany's post-war recovery, prepare for the Nazis' return to power, and work for a strong German empire. In other words, the Fourth Reich. Now, the 3-page report was marked secret, and it was copied to British officials and sent by air pouch to Cordell Hull, the U.S. Secretary of State. And it detailed how the industrialists were to work with the Nazi Party to rebuild Germany's economy by sending money through Switzerland. That they would set up a network of secret front companies abroad, and they would wait until conditions were right, and then they would take over Germany again. And some of the industrialists that, front companies they would use would be Volkswagen, Krupp, Messerschmitt. Was an inspiration by that. But what's interesting about this is the Nazis, they knew their time was up, that things were ending. This report, the Red House report that the CIA did, it makes it to the Secretary of State of America to tell them, it's basically to tell them what their plans are. There's nowhere that says Cordell Hull was repulsed and aired this out and spoke about it.
No, but what you do know is that after the war, Operation Paperclip happens, and the U.S. brings thousands of Nazis over to the U.S., supposedly they're scientists and whatever.
Doctors,
whatever
engineers,
value that they
lawyers.
have. And, you end up getting the founding of NASA out of this. And
Werner von Braun was a Nazi. He was not innocent in what he did in Germany. He was the head of NASA when we went to the moon, which is interesting.
So, next month, this is going to be a good, there's a lot to this. It's really thick.
And it has to do with the creation of the EU and how instead of having with the Third Reich, which was a military empire, the goal was to have an economic empire. And basically that's what we have. And that's what we're battling against, is us versus this economic empire. But if you can see that economic empire for the Nazis that they are, which they accuse you of being, it just kind of puts everything in perspective.
Yeah.
I can't even believe the things that I've read about the Red House report.
But you come out of World War II, you start getting into the late 40s, you get into the 50s, and then everything, the TV comes out, I guess, 52, 53, and the TV screen starts to take over how we see the world.
Right.
And then you get the music industry and the entertainment industry, and you've got Walt Disney, and actually Walt Disney worked with all of these guys.
They did, all coding your brain.
And so then you start getting into this false sense of nostalgia of what things were, and it kind of keeps you passive and kind of locked into a false history of where you come from.
Right.
And we have this, it kind of gets idealized.
Right.
You want to go back to the past. I don't want to go back to the past. I don't even want to go back to pre-COVID at all.
Right.
Because we were asleep and we had a veil over our.
Yeah, I don't want to go back to the past when we were asleep at the wheel.
And we were letting this our morality in our neighborhoods and everything just to keep declining. And so this is 2020 to me was a wake-up call.
Yeah.
And it's like we're being flashed with so many truths, and sometimes it can be overwhelming, but just remember God has a plan, and it's actually already been successful.
Right.
He's outside of time.
Right.
And it's already, we've got to play our parts.
Right.
And I'm not saying we don't have free will, we do, but he's outside of time kind of makes a different context for it.
And right now, the enemy, Satan, they think that they're winning. And I happen to think that Biden and all those people, there's a lot of people on the Biden side that probably worship a different God than we do. They're, the baby killers and They think that they're winning. But
well, and there could be, there's it, like we try to stay out of the red blue paradigm because it's not real. I think there's a lot of people in DC that are could be some evil people.
Yeah.
And they have plans, but they're not going to be successful. And they're going to try some nostalgic tools in the future.
They are, but it's not going to work because we've already seen behind the curtain, and we already know that what we remember and how we remember it is wrong, and that nothing that we believe was actually real. And we're kind of having to like deconstruct our own.
Yeah. And we have to gird ourselves looking ahead and for our battles that are coming, because it's going to get hard, but that hard does not mean bad.
Right.
It's going to hone.
It's going to hone you.
You're like a piece of steel that's being honed. It's going to be used for good in the future if you look at this right. And so, looking forward, we're in that spiritual battle that me and Yvonne should have been in the 90s, probably.
Right.
Starting in the 90s and the 2000s. And I voted for George W. Bush. And,
wish I could take that back.
In 2000. But you look back at that and you go, so what if Al Gore had won?
Right.
Would we still have?
What would have been different? They're all warmongers.
Yeah. And it's like now Trump came through office, and now all of a sudden soldiers are going back into Syria, and we're talking about Iran again. I'm like, okay.
Right.
So it doesn't, the president itself, it doesn't have this huge bearing on your life.
It's you out here. It's the people. And the faster we have this great awakening, the better off we're all going to be.
And I know there's things right now that I'm not seeing.
Yeah.
That I need to start being aware of. So we need to start looking at this differently, and
right.
Ourselves included. We've got to.
We did a scope one time on all roads lead to Rome.
Yeah.
So if we could tie in a virus and the simulation that we did last January, all roads lead to Rome, and this Red House report where it goes into detail how they're going to construct the Fourth Reich, which is an economic empire, and that's exactly what we have now.
And a few months ago, also, we talked about 1976, a pandemic that never was compared to 2020.
Right.
Because, Trump and lauded this warp speed vaccine.
Yeah.
That doesn't beat 1976. I've always wondered. Nobody brought up 1976.
I know.
The scare that happened then. They brought a vaccine out and killed a bunch of people and then pulled the vaccine.
And paralyzed others.
All of thousands probably.
Over a pandemic that never was.
And they did all this inside of 11 months, 10
right.
or 11 months. So
this wasn't the first time there was a warp speed vaccine. That was the first time.
That was even quicker.
Yeah. Yeah.
It took almost over a year, or right at a year. They did this in like 10 months. And by 10 or 11 months, it was pulled. And I think what did we say? It was 60 million Americans?
I think it was 80 million.
It was a lot.
It was 80 million.
And Gerald Ford supposedly got vaccinated.
Yeah, you can, if you Google the pandemic that never was 1976, you'll immediately see a picture of Gerald Ford. He went on live TV to get the vaccine, in the same kind of propaganda that they have done with Obama and Mike Pence getting their vaccines on TV. And, who knows if they're getting what we're getting.
Yeah. I think some people are getting a placebo, and some are getting something else.
Right.
It just depends on which company. I think probably certain companies are designated with making a certain way.
Right.
Because how do you make a vaccine from something where you haven't even identified the virus in the first place?
Right.
It's a computer simulation.
Whole nother rabbit hole there. But the point of this scope is the nostalgia, the remembering of something that happened, years ago that warms your heart. The truth of the matter is, unless it's, remembering your grandmother's baked bread and this, that if it's historical, it's not real. It's fake.
Yeah. If you have nostalgia for something that happened before you have memories, or before you were born, or it's outside of you, like
it's what they've created. It's what they coded.
There are people in this country that have nostalgia about Woodstock.
Yeah.
And they were never there. They were kids, or they weren't even born yet.
They heard the story
Nostalgia
that the
was
media has portrayed.
Woodstock was this great place, and there was peace and love.
And actually, it was
and all
very
this,
unclean and dirty, and lots of bad things happened there.
And there's actually a rabbit hole on that as well.
Yeah, there's a rabbit hole everywhere you turn. But this Red House report is a rabbit hole that's you got to watch next month's scope, because it's gonna blow your mind. And like, just like with IBM that did the punch cards for the Holocaust, it's kind of along that same lines, and it just shows you how anytime there's something negative that happens in history, it's going to be rewritten, and it's going to be put on the opposition.
Yeah.
That's how Republicans got the bad rap, as being the racist. And we see them doing it now with the Stop the Steal movement and what happened on January 6th, and them trying to tie that into GameStop. It doesn't matter. Like, if you're an enemy of them, the elite, you're going to get the negative stigma. It's very cold and calculated.
But you know what? Use your nostalgia tool that you have, and use it in a good way, and remember those good times, actual memories that you have,
right?
That you remember, and you can kind of put it forward to when you see stuff in the media. Maybe start discounting things because you weren't there. You don't know the people involved.
Yeah, start asking yourself, why do you feel like, if you feel a negative, reaction to something you've read that happened in the past, ask yourself why. Why do you have this negative reaction? Start researching it, and you'll soon figure out that all is not as it seems.
Maybe you're being manipulated.
Right.
And it's easy for all of us to be manipulated because there's so much out there.
And maybe that's what the simulation is. It's just this control of it's the spiritual battle.
Yeah. And I think that's a good thing, is pray for discernment and wisdom, and pray for pray for understanding, pray for getting information to you the way you could understand it. I pray for that. I've been praying for that lately. Is just like, please feed me information that I can understand,
process it,
and that I want discernment
and know it to be true.
Because you all have that. You don't have to just listen to a tube and then form your opinion that way.
Right. So that's all we've got for tonight. We'll be back next month, February 13th.
We'll shoot for the 13th and
see if we can do it on the 13th. If not, it'll be shortly thereafter, and it's going to be about the Red House report, and it's going to blow your mind. So you don't want to miss it.
All right. Thanks, everybody.